Bienvenue à la web-diffusion. N'hésitez pas à poser vos questions lors de la présentation en les inscrivant dans l'espace prévu à cette...
Please ask your questions using the right space for it. We wish you a beautiful session. And this is a go. For our second panel from the Agence de Mobilité Durable, I'm Marc-André Carignan. I'm a host and I'm a specialist in the field of urban planning. I'm very happy to see that you are well connected here, and I see attendees here. You're quite generous. Thank you for being here. We've just talked a few weeks ago, and I think you were with us. This was the first panel that we had about electrifying our fleet and so on, how to go from theory to practice. So this is a totally different point of view. We're going to talk about parking. This is interesting. This is the well-known topic, the holy grail, parking. I mean, I'm saying this with a smile because there's something visceral, something cultural about parking, because I've covered municipal news for about a dozen years. And when we talk about withdrawing parking, a few spaces for whatever reasons, for cycling or whatever, and some people always ask us, journalists always ask us, how much space is withdrawn? And so this is something that's related to our North American culture. A few decades ago, the car was the way to go for the future. If we wanted to be a modern city, we had to put asphalt everywhere around the city. We needed parkings for the city, for suburbs, and so on. But now we look at things differently. We're in 2022. Maybe we're at a different level. We have to manage mobility. So this may seem contradictory, but the topic for today is about parking. Parking being a leverage for sustainable development. And it may seem contradictory to talk about parking and sustainable development. People think that these two things are contradictory, but we should not demonize parking. We should demonstrate today with our different panel members that these can go hand in hand. And so we can manage better parking for sustainable development, maybe. So I'd like to invite you to ask questions. If you have any questions, we can address them later. If you are watching virtually, if you leave the full screen mode, you have a chatting box or chatting zone, and you can send your questions through that as we go and as we see the presentation, and we'll try to cover these as much as we can during the next hour. There are about dozens of cities watching this. We're drawing attention pretty much throughout Quebec, a lot of people watching from Quebec and around. So there's a key word, hashtag RDV, rendezvous, for the Montreal Agence Mobilité Durable. And so that's a key word. And that's it. So be careful about your phones and your alarms and settings and so on. Here are our panel members. They join us, and let's proceed in this way. Let's proceed in an orderly way. Pierre Soumet is an advisor for Vivre en Ville. Thank you for being here. And we have Charles de la Chevretière, Director, Business Strategy and Mobility, l'Agence de Mobilité Durable. Florence, we meet each other on roundtables. You work for the Chaire internationale sur les usages et pratiques de la ville intelligente, Smart Cities, for l'École des sciences de la gestion from UQAM University. Thank you for being here. And I forgot one person, Lara Molina, in charge of political pedestrian projects, how to use public space. She's from Paris, directly from Paris. Welcome. And we also have Marco Viviani, Vice President, Strategic Development from Communauto. We see you often on public spaces in the media, and we've talked about some of your topics recently. Now, let's start with a more general question, because before we talk about management, so how do we provide sustainable development thanks to parking? If we talk about parking management, the first question for you, Mr. Chevretière, what are we talking about? Where's the alpha and omega in terms of parking management? If we talk about the AMD in Montreal, l'Agence de Mobilité Durable. For AMD, we were careful in Montreal because we know that the streets in Montreal, space, we know that for parking space, 75% of the space is already occupied. either for going through streets or to park cars and so on. This is not set in time, though. I'm happy to look at old pictures dating back to the First World War, the 20s. The street was for everyone. We had pedestrians, of course, and cars and all sorts of horses and so on. But now we wanted to give all that space to for parking. But we're talking about public space. We have to go backwards. If we talk about transportation, there are two components. One is very dynamic. One is about moving around. The other one's static. We would never think that a bus line could be created without thinking about the places where the buses will stop, the stops, and so on. And so, but we eliminated parking from the whole car circulation model. But sometimes we said it's too complicated. It recurs. We're referring to all sorts of different knowledge. We just said, get your act together, do what you want, and use whatever space is possible. This was a binary model. You either took collective transportation or your car. We didn't talk about bicycles. This is a new thing in North America. So all of a sudden, we have the street component, the parking on the street, and then there's outside of the street sector parking. And so in the 30s, 40s, 50s, engineers in transportation quickly realized that there would be a lot of cars. We had to accommodate for them. And so for each commercial activity and so on, for all those social roles, we provided some parking space in order to avoid having people having to just park in the middle of the street and so on. So parking space is limited. So we need to manage parking. We need to find the right balance. We need to understand things. And so if we talk about parking management, we have to understand the need. And so this matter is not well understood because for a long time we paid for meters with coins and so on. We don't have a lot of data, and there are too many parking lots and so on. And so we didn't know what the real needs are. And now we have a better understanding of needs. And now we could say this space for parking, could we not use that rather to extend the walking paths and so on, cycling paths and so on. At EMD, we want to talk about more equity, security, accessibility when we talk about sidewalks and so on, management of parking lots. So you've talked about data. Laurence, this is the bread and butter of your research center. Without data, it's really hard to manage parking space or anything about mobility. So you're in your chair of research, you deal with those things. Okay. There's public space that's dedicated for storage of cars, as we said in the past, but it's very important to have a good understanding of flows, of stocks, as we say, how people use the space. We have to understand how the immediate environment works. There are needs for the community and so on. And the parking lots are positioned in that space. We need to understand that because what really matters for this, it's territorial understanding, contextualization. There's no single silver bullet solution. We can't have just one policy for parking. We need to have different approaches, different styles of management for parking spaces. This needs to be customized. Now, we come from somewhere to park. There's destination. So there's destination because people come from somewhere else to park. But this is public space. Now, I'm going to ramble too much here. I'm going to say, okay, this is linear in public space. I'm going to repeat this, but it could be more than just a storage place, as we say. There are activities around. We can have a lively street, but these will change depending on residential areas. We have different options to entertain them. And I like to use the term knowledge. We need knowledge because data, massive, gross data is one thing, but there are other data which is related to how you use the parking space. And we'll need those data also to make decisions about linear and public space parking. This can be optimized, recovered, and so on. This could be used differently for mobility and for planning. Parking management is at the borders at a crossroads between transportation mobility policies and urban planning, how you plan the city. it's at the crossroads of all these things, because this is a flexible space that belongs to the collective realm. And so it's very important to think about that. You talked about the parking as a destination, as an arrival point destination. But for your colleague, a parking is a departure point in order to rent cars and so on. You see things in a different way. For us, it's a departure point, right? But I'd like to refer to what Charles was saying earlier. We always forget that for our transportation systems, there's a departure point, an arrival point, and there's an itinerary and connectivity. We do this for everything. What, right? For a plane, for train transportation, we consider that, but we don't consider those things for car transportation. Now, I think that here we're pretty much all in agreement about the things that we're going to say. So, okay, we'll interact. Hold on a second. Maybe not. Anyway, we need to see how we will debate. But what I want to say here is that there's lack of knowledge about parking. Sometimes we forget about this when we think about the whole transportation chain and so on, considering all the things that are involved. And we take it for granted, yes, but there's something which is about culture. There's a cultural component, even with convinced people. I was told by the mayor from a very progressist city, he said, aren't you going to lose advertising space? So see, the thing is, even himself said that there was space that was reduced, if you want. Culturally, he thought that parking spaces were considered as something separate. We should not touch that. It's better not to know much about this, according to him. But once we know what this really entails, then we ask questions, and we, I'm creating problems here. We see that there isn't much parking space. For example, in Montreal, if something is going to transform mobility in terms of urban planning, it's this whole parking thinking. People have thought about this, but people haven't wanted to address this, very likely. So, in the way we look at things, so things may not be too comfortable. That's why we avoid them. Okay. We were just starting to manage parking spaces, but in the majority of cases, this is a very basic management. We offer some space. We ask the private sector to offer space. There's only 4% of parking spaces which are related to a tariff, a rate out of 500,000 spaces, and so on. The whole idea, or the first reflex, is to offer free space. It's almost for free parking space. But we have to challenge this if we want to change things regarding mobility, regarding independence, car independence. We have to forget this, and we should stop offering free space like that for parking. Otherwise we're shooting ourselves on the foot. The whole idea is to see how we can manage space and so on. And that space, currently, we offer it for free, as if this was a private storage.
So we have this for granted. So I would see Kara that wanted to speak, I believe. I'd like to hear your point about the definition. What's your definition of mobility management? Yes. So I'd like to say that in Paris, there was a reform of parking lots. This was a lever of transformation of the public space. A transition also towards other types of mobility. So this notion of spacing was the reconquest of the public space. This was part of our discussions. There isn't a lot of space available in Paris right now. We cannot give it away for free. And we have to make sure that space answers the current needs of a modern city. Yes. And I believe that when we talk about management, often we have been talking in silos, as you've been saying, Pierre-Yves. Many people want parking, some are offering parking, but there is not much communication between offer and supply. In the evening, office space is empty and so on. So there is this communication lack in between the private sector and private sector. Sometimes parking lots are underground. We can't see them. You think there's no parking. So there's a lack of management. There's a lack of communication. Often it's private versus public. And am I right to say this? Yes, that's what's happening. And even for municipal regulations, they were generating more parking availability than the demand. There is a disconnect. More and more, we are seeing this mutualization idea. So both for land connected to public space, many large spaces are empty in the city. There might be colleges, schools. We sometimes do it for sports facilities. We use that type of equipment. So why not also for parking? And sometimes when we add up everything that's available in terms of parking lots, there are too many of them, way too much. We need to have this common understanding. We need to open up this street, which is a linear layout. We have to open up that space. There's going to be an interest in these infrastructures underground on or over the ground. There needs to be more mutualization. Okay, so we can take it both ways. What are the limits? What are the stakes? Where do we start? Trying to go beyond the current limitations. Florence, when we're talking about the parking lot management for sustainable mobility, what's missing right now in Montreal or in other cities in order to be able to have something sustainable? Yes, let me start by saying, let's not talk only about Montreal. So altogether, we are trying to open up this system, which is creating a lot of locks, a lot of inertia in connection to cars. By definition, we want to work with these parking lots where we store cars. Now, if we can't use that anymore, we need to optimize. What we want to have is to make sure we work with essential link. So this starts with this political will that will try to fix objectives of sustainable mobility, making sure we have this long-term vision, trying to mobilize resources. This seems trivial, but we need to have the political vision first, this common vision first. Political vision on the long term, objectives, and what are the means to reach these objectives. Yes, optimization of parking lots, of course, and also the reduction of these parking lots, maybe some alternatives. We also want to reduce the use of cars. We need to reduce our dependency of cars. It's not only optimizing, but this is a second notion. So sometimes we see what cities are doing. They have metropolitan parking policies. Other cities have municipal policies. Others have local plans. So it can be done on different scales. We have to see what's more relevant, but there are these types of very contextualized projects. But beyond that, we need regulations, we need a process, and this is the boring part of it. We need some limitations, constraints, some urban planning rules about parking standards so that the minimum parking requirements will be met. Well, this exists in many localities, but this should be generalized so that we're going to have the right offering in different regions. We can reduce the parking ratios, and if we have an over parking offering, public or private, we can mutualize these parkings, working with different uses. But we need some regulations that could be applied locally. And therefore, we need a vision, and the plan will be lesser parkings, more parkings that are optimized. We can recover this public space. And let's agree that there are issues. What's not working? This is quite sensitive. And this is very, very sensitive for some people, but we need some dialogue, some debate with those that think that when we take some of these parking lots, we are losing sales, if this is in front of their store. So we need to make people aware about the positive impacts. We need a dialogue, which is sometimes very challenging. This is feasible with the users of these parking lots. Marco? Yes, I agree. So all of this reflection process, if it's based on good knowledge, on good data, this is going to allow us to agree with the population. And then we will have the political courage. So we can understand that when these spaces are used, how can we use them? How can we optimize them? So if you pay for a parking lot in Montreal or elsewhere, even though you have removed a parking lot, there needs to be a plan. If it's well understood, if you look at before and after, if we have the right knowledge, the right data, we can present a plan. What do we want to do with this territory? What will be the vision? What will be the urban planning so that people will come in agreement? And so, yeah, it's different from having a parking lot everywhere. What about you? Yes, everybody wants a higher level of equity, and parking lots are non-equitable. This is true for both public and private parking lots. So if you go to a mall, everybody pays for these parking lots, even though you might visit this shopping mall and if you travel with the urban transit bus. So we need to be able to change these things, these challenges. It's not just working with parking lots. We need to match these reforms with other reforms that connect to everybody, such as housing. We need more housing. One of the possible solutions is by reducing the cost of this housing. How can you reduce the cost? By reducing the number of parking lots in these housing units. In Oregon, there is a law that forbids cities to go beyond a certain ratio. So it's no more than one parking lot per apartment, for instance. So they reduce the number of parking lots. So this is not a state reform, but this is a local reform for housing. So if you have units of 2 or 3 apartments, they need to agree upon the number of parking lots. So if you attach this with something we all aspire for, such as social justice, for a better mobility, this is very important to make sure that deciders agree with us as well. At the agency, we are building this knowledge. In transportation, we often say there is a lack of data. Yes, so we have a two-pronged approach. The first one, we have been working on the inventory of sidewalks. We want to optimize. We want to better manage the limits or the sidewalks, but we need to know everything about that. This is the first element. And then eventually there's going to be the reading of our capacity. We want to better understand the use of these limits. Secondly, we want to know the public and private aspects. We are working, parking means that beyond this working silos, as you've been saying, there is also a lack of understanding. There's a lack of data. Who manages what? Who pays for what? What's the real cost? And even for private stakeholders, it's not very clear. So beyond the number of parking lots, there's also how much does that cost? And there's also the snow. There's the maintenance of these spaces as well. Yes, go ahead. Something negative. There's also the cost of parking lots for the whole society. So if we have this dependence of cars and dependence to parking lots, there are accidents. This is a connection to health. There is a connection to the cost, the overall cost. It's quite complicated to calculate, but this offering we don't know very well the offer. So if you have a park meter, you can take that into account. But yes, so sometimes we don't know well the supply of parking lots. But what's the limitation? Sometimes there's a lack of regulations. So there are many parking lots that are not well delineated. Yes, we have been talking about silos. There will need to be more collaboration with the private sector. We have been talking about changing behaviors, but it's also for the owners. They need to be able to better inform with the Paris agency, with the Montreal agency. We want to better understand and better manage these spaces. We need the collaboration with the private sector as well. Yes? Florence was talking about the political will, about reducing the number of parking lots. In Paris, you want to reduce 50% of these parking lots, right? In the streets. Now, what's the horizon? And I guess that there's no unanimity. Well, yeah, the mission is quite challenging. And we want to reduce 50% of parking lots for 2026. So this is a short horizon of time. And it's important to clarify that we have been talking about street parkings. In Paris, this represents 18% of the total supply of parkings. And half of this 18% is less dramatic, so to speak, for those that want these parking lots in terms of acceptance. So let me go back to this question of knowledge, knowing where is the supply of parkings, who uses these parking lots. In Paris, the method that was used before this reform, there has been a large consultation process. We have shared the data, the information. So the parkings on surface, parkings in buildings, in public spaces as well in the city, and also the use that was done by visitors, residents, and so on. So we have shared all of this data. It's been called the États généraux du stationnement. So this was something that has prepared that reform. Thank you. In parallel, is there also a strategy to make sure that people will be aware of all of this? Saying, you said under the huge buildings that are underground parkings, is there a strategy to make sure that people will be aware if there are visitors so that they won't be looking for parking lots for too much of a time? Yes. So there's going to be a better posters everywhere, better information.
This is for residential and tertiary facilities beyond the inhabitants and the people that work there. This is well not known. There's work about making sure that that offer is visible. We have to share that because that supply, if you want, is underused. Those things are empty. So we have parking lots that are 50% empty. So there's underground stuff also. And then Paris tries to work with some social stakeholders that do some lobbying. There are intermediate players also, and some are working at that level to rent parking lots. A whole ecosystem is reinvented, is being set up. The potential is huge. We can create a big shift so that a big chunk of the parking space can be underground. So there's a supply, and the supply can really meet with the needs in Paris for parking. We know that more than 60% of the population doesn't have a car in Paris. We have to remember that that's what happens in the city. So in terms of supply, this is overextended in regards, is super big compared to the needs. We go well beyond that ratio here in Quebec, though. But Bruno Marchand, the mayor of Quebec City, I mean, would that be a great objective, 50% for the upcoming years? 50%, I mean, we're far from that, but over many years, it's absolutely possible. One of the examples that is well named is the Copenhagen example. For many years, they brought things down 4%, up to 4%. You know, you reduce things little by little over the years. It means you no longer have a big need. We could transfer that somewhere else. We have to nuance things. There's a link between both. This is about the laws of the market. So the whole market is flawed in the sense that if you want to compete with free supply or under price supply, you know, it depends on the vignettes. I don't know how much you have to pay for the different boroughs of Montreal. We're paying very cheap. This is far away from the market price. So this goes to that also. We have to be able to make sure that things are competitive. We have to create a natural link between the two supplies. We need to make sure that the tariffs, the rates are the ones that correspond to the market. Go ahead.
Je pense pas que le défi c'est vraiment celle de l'interconnexion.
The real challenge is about interconnectivity in terms of the public-private connectivity. I think that cities should have the tools to be able to do things right. I come from a city where 400,000 vehicles per day got into the city when I left, and they didn't have any physical space to park. You know, so we've worked a lot on underground parking, and if you go there, it's Milano. We were quite successful in terms of parking, and you will find that the cars are parked on the sidewalks, you know. And we said we're going to build underground stuff and structures and so on, but we haven't really been successful in terms of the public space. And so there's free spaces still. And so people can park on the sidewalks and so on. This relationship means what? I'm not an expert here in terms of the regulatory, but you may have some difficulties here, but I think that there's something that goes beyond collaborating with the private sector. We need to set rules also. We need to set rules, and things may be constraining here. Florence and Charlotte, I'd like to come back to you. What was said about Paris? We said Paris is different from Montreal and so on. But we have a high density areas which look like that. So half of the households have a car, more than half don't have a car. And so we see those households. And so we have the central areas of Montreal. We have a lot of parked cars on the streets. So we have to think about that in terms of the residential tariffs. They're not very high for the vignettes and so on, but they vary from one borough to another. This is something, but rates or tariffs are different. There's disparity between the different boroughs. There's no common thinking about this. And there's a certain leeway, which is extremely high. We could have similarities or things that bring us closer, and we could really optimize things, getting information from one another. We don't really think a lot or enough about relocating parking units or lots besides in front of a business, in front of a residence, systematically. So this is the linear culture. We just go through the movements and we don't think too much about relocating things. Now, this has come, the time has come for mutualizing things with the private sectors, whatever, or bringing cars outside of certain areas, certain roads and so on, as is the case in other cities. And I think that there's a leeway progression margin, which is quite high. And this goes through some regulations, which means somebody will have to wear a very annoying hat, you know, and it's the boroughs and the cities that must come up with regulations. It can't just be incentives. It has to be a mix of both coercion and incentives, not just incentives. What you said is excellent about the market. There are two things about the agency, AMD. We've created a pilot project about mutualization, and we've learned a lot from that experience. We must develop a business model behind this, indeed. And right now, there's the Alliance Centre-Ville Société Développement Commercial du Centre-Ville, which has just published a study, which is really interesting. And parking is at the very heart of this strategy. They say we have to stop playing cutthroat games. We have to start working together. We have to create standards, a single tariff for all the owners. People need to know where they can go, what's the likelihood of finding some parking lots. This information must be pooled together about tariffs. We need to have a reasonable level of quality. There are parking lots that are far from being interesting. So where can we take people from the street and send them into really etchy, dark places in terms of unit lots? It's not a good thing. It's sketchy. So sometimes it's easier to just park on the street and then you do whatever you have to do during the day. But we have to explain why parking is used. On the street parking, it's mainly for a short term, to deliver something. But the long duration parking lot is there when you need to spend a lot of time doing an activity. There's a learning curve. We need to start with pedagogy. With the elected representatives for business people and for young professionals also need to educate people because that's very important for future planning. Let's talk about urban planning. We said that we had a lot of free lots and we had to opt for constraints. Mainly Mr. Chavot, director from the agency, who was quoted in the press. There was a story saying that there will be less and less free lots in downtown Montreal. Will rates change, tariffs change, they will evolve throughout the years, maybe. And so this is part of the thinking process. This was a topic, the object of research, Florence. Yes. Not really. Not about tariffs or pricing. What's the impact of rates on behavior? I work more regarding, I work on collective transportation and the impacts on tariffing and so on. There was an overproduction of free parking lots. If we consider the island of Montreal, for example, that scale, we zoom on certain sectors, then we'll find more pricing tariffs in the downtown center, Montreal, and so on. But for certain cases, it depends. This is a whole history about car mobility. It's underbuilt. It's been like that for a long time. Now, regarding collective mobility, that's the first thing. Now, we need to offer parking spaces for free. Well, it's like you are motivating people to use their car if you do that. And I think it's a mistake to offer free space for parking, because you're conveying a message saying, no problem, just use your car, go to that area, no matter what the area. But I mean, depending on, of course, notwithstanding the area maybe, but we're not really aware of the impact of the use of cars. And there are multiple impacts also with that free impact, the impact when it's offered for free. And so we want mobility today. We want to develop humble, fair mobility. So free parking lot space, that becomes an issue. And tariffs, fees. I mean, you need the right fee, because if the hourly fee is too low, then people just pay. And so you need sanctions. If you can't pay, you need to be punished. Okay, that's the second question. The follow-up, how fees will change behavior. Go ahead. In Geneva, for instance, they have a size which is about ours, 50%. I mean, nobody talks about kilometer base or SWAN fees. They can just control flows, how they raise their fees. And there are no questions asked. They just bring higher fees for parking. Cara was saying yes, nodding in terms of fees, tariffs, fees. Well, parking is not for fee for a long time. It's been like that, but not everywhere. There was a reformation, as we say it, which means that in the Bois de Vincennes and Bois de Vincennes and Boulogne forest areas, we had a lot of space. This was inherited from earlier decision making, but then this was complicated with inhabitants, and so you had free parking, and this again, the people were used to not have to pay for parking. The public space is a public wealth, if you want, and it belongs to everyone. So it has a value. So we have to tell people how much valuable it is. We have to tell people what can we do to replace unit lots, and we need to develop. We need to improve the well-being and the living possibilities in the city so as to bring more value to the city, improving the life of inhabitants. We have to raise the awareness about that. We have to mention that there's value about this in terms of fees and so on. You saw a real change of behavior with people. In Paris, most of parking lots were paid parking lots. And so this was the case. And this was said also for Montreal. I think cost the fee that you pay for residential parking. This is extremely low, and for inhabitants, it's less costly to park in the street rather than park their cars in another place with infrastructures and so on, which is more expensive. So it's more economical for people to leave their cars on the street. So we have to develop fees. The fees for street parking is getting closer and closer to those that are the underground paid parkings. You know, we have to make sure that there's less advantageous for people to park on the street. It has to be more economical for them to park in an underground space. There's visitors space also parking with a different fee. The visitor fee was considered also. Then there's a visitor's fee, which means that sometimes we cannot stay too long on the same parking unit or lot. And so there's a rollover or rotation factor that's considered in order to share that space.
So this is all very important. You've mentioned the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. This is not something which is ideological. Just reducing and better managing parking lots. This needs to be connected to advantages. All of this can be explained. So if you're able to explain, of course, there will need to be a transition. Still, after, it's going to be a win-win situation. People will understand. They will be supporters. This is very important. Otherwise, it might be different. Also, I just want to talk positively of the Montreal Mobility Agency. This is about monitoring. And I think that parents started to do changes. Before that, nobody was monitoring parkings. I know people that said, oh, if I have to pay a ticket, it's so cheap. No problem. I'm going to park anywhere in the city, even though I get a ticket. It might be €2, something very cheap. And now that they've changed the rules and they're monitoring, now the cost is much higher. So it might be up to $1,000 of tickets to pay if you're squatting a parking unit for a long time. Yes. Yes. So this is what happened in Paris. And Montreal has also been improving, I guess, but let's not lose sight of that capacity. Okay, soon we're going to the Q&A session. I don't know if there's a microphone in the room and people working or people that are present virtually, remotely, also please ask questions. Don't hesitate. Yes, regarding the cost or the value of parking lots, we've been talking about street parking, residential parking. You have to compare apples with apples. What's the benefit of turning a parking lot into a bike path? Or if you do terraces in Toronto, they've assessed that it brings much more clients if they are terraces rather than park meters. So, and even there's a difference up to 50 times the price. So if it costs $150 to have this parking permit, the context might be different, but you have to make the right comparisons. Are you ready to pay on the street to park on the street? What's the real value of a street parking unit? Yes, we pay between up to $900 a year per one parking unit. And I think that it is the Environment Agency that had made this average. This is something reasonable, taking into account the maintenance of the road, the snowing work that's required, cleaning the, removing the snow. Yes. So when we ask for a parking unit, sometimes we don't get it. It's okay to subsidize parking up to a certain level. This reduces the travel by car for households. This might be a good idea if you find them parking spots. Yes, there's something interesting as well. So people want to have free parking, of course, that's what they expect, but usually we pay for that with 1,300 per car, 1,300 divided by 30 household, you pay much less. And this parking unit has much more value. Yes, the sharing of a parking spot is a good idea. We can measure also the impact of bike paths or some streets where you have more people walking there. So if there are terraces, cafes, sidewalks, this creates an impact on households, a positive impact on households. We have to work with stakeholders. Yes. So if there are more pedestrians, all of that can be quite positive. Yes. So we need to make people aware. We need to present the evidence more and more. We have meta-analysis of all of these developments. We see that thanks to sustainable mobility, this creates some positive impact. I've also seen the Toronto studies. Now, these are the last minutes that we have. We've been talking about Geneva. We have something from somebody from Toronto, somebody from Paris. Did you get any inspiration about parking lot management for sustainable mobility? Any city is an inspiration, and why? Anybody could be implemented here? Anything could be implemented here, rather? Yes, we can mention a few cities. First of all, Paris, regarding their inventory. Their strategy is at the forefront. There's also Amsterdam. They have the automated reading of car license plates. Toronto is an inspiration due to their dialogue with promoters to ensure that they are thinking about mutualization of parking right from the onset. And also, Montreal is inspiring. They've created this wheel. We have been talking about monitoring, and in Montreal, we include this in our management right away. This means we can intervene on streets, on bike paths. If there is a car blocking the bus, it's not a good idea. Also, some parking units for people with reduced mobility. I know that the Montreal model is also quite inspiring for other cities. What about you? In Paris? Yes. Now, if we have any inspiration, I cannot tell you right away. We have been looking at European capitals in how they manage parking lots. We've also considered their tariffs of parkings. We've realized that in Paris, the tariff is way under what you find in other European capitals. Yes, it's always very interesting to look what others are doing. This is a must to do. And of course, we have considered what's also done elsewhere. Then I cannot tell you if I have one example to mention. There are many examples that have inspired what we are doing in Paris. Laurent or Laurence, we have been talking, but what about smart cities? Any inspiration regarding smart cities in your research? Yes, regarding research and knowledge and evidence, it's not so much about finding inspiration in cities, but we want to study scenarios and those scenarios that are not working. Oh, this scenario is not working that well. So what about public policies? We are working a lot with different approaches. So regarding smart cities, it's not so much what we hear about it, but it's mostly about governance, stakeholders. What does that mean? And technology as well? Yes. Yes. Usually we talk of technology, but what about future needs in urban settings? What is the right governance? We've done studies with the City of Montreal, with the mobility plan for Montreal. We've studied the factors of cars and households, inequalities of mobility, these big shifts we have been talking of. Of course, we also do some cross-referencing Vancouver and their residential parking policy with stakeholders as well. So yeah, so we get some inspirations, multiple inspirations. Researchers will not say which one is the best practice. This might be a trap, but we want to learn lessons. If we see some issues, how can we face the issues? Or we are in a different universe. We try to learn things to rectify the Montreal situation, for instance. So it might be many kinds of inspirations from Europe as well. We can compare to Europe a little bit if we are in the North American continent. So I cannot tell you more precisely, but we have looked at several cities and different scenarios. Yes, what about car sharing? In Quebec, we are doing quite well on that regard, and more we are thinking about car sharing. Yes, generally speaking, I think that it's difficult to find the city because many cities are stuck a little bit in that same type of dynamic, trying to find the best solutions in order to acknowledge the problems first and then find the best solutions. So there are many things that we can find here and there. Now, if I focus on the service supply, service offering, parking lots, car sharing, of course, in Belgium, it's quite interesting. For instance, we can focus on Brussels. They have a plan. Every year, they define what type of increase they want for car sharing. So they will identify these parking units that will be available for car sharing. And so they want to reach their objectives. And so there are businesses that will be working, yes, with them, yes. So they find these parking lot units and they are made available for car sharing. So they have objectives. They want to manage these parking lots. They want to reach their objectives. Citizens have to be part of the equation, and that's how they do it. We got a question from the participants, from the audience. Is there an oversupply of private parking lots? Is this any learned lesson about these private parking lots? I know that somewhere they have implemented a policy where there is a ratio of parkings that will be part of the municipal assessment. So this will increase the cost of parking. So this might be an opportunity to do something else. It seems that this is something that is used. It's not that frequent though. Now, in Montreal, they have been working with the taxation of street parking with insurers because surface parking has been taxed more, saying that this is not the use that we want for these spaces. We want other types of activities. So this has allowed Montreal to reduce the number of these surface parking lots. There were many, many of them before. Yes. Yes, there might be some rebound effects. The right to pay more for a parking lot. There are compensation mechanisms for projects where it's possible to negotiate for compensation for promoters. You are going to pay something to the city that will be in charge of parking, or you will compensate. There are different kinds of mechanisms. What happens is that there might be some perverse effect in that. There might be some disadvantages. Okay, we got a question here at the back. Go ahead. Hello. I am working at the Conseil Régional Environnement. I was going to talk about taxes, taxations, and you have already addressed that part. So in Montreal, there are some spaces that are taxed. And I think that this is something we have to include in the fight against climate change. So in the future, if there are going to be new buildings, new constructions, or renovations, if we want to adapt the city to the rhythm of these climate changes, are there any incentives we should think of to be more efficient, such as taxation? That could be a tool that can be used in order to attribute a value, and this is going to encourage mutualization, and it is going to improve the reduction of these heat spots in the city, heat islands. Something else, we have been talking about parking lots at the metropolitan level. What about the parking outside of the downtown area? There are the central boroughs. There is a right level of acceptance, but what about the municipalities in the suburbs or outside of the city of Montreal? How can we invite these areas to develop better, to consider if they want to go to the downtown area, some areas to answer their needs? Oh, would you like to answer? Yes, let me try to answer. Montreal, despite the COVID pandemic, and I look forward to see the results of the survey, which is being done right now. So Montreal is still an important point in terms of attraction of mobility. So if we work on the parking lots in Montreal, this is going to have an impact on the regional mobility, of course. And then there's a forum on June 1st. We're going to hear your speech about the inclusion of suburbs for the management of parking lots. Yes, but there are connections, of course, in the mobility if you go downtown from the suburbs. Of course, all of that is interconnected. Yes? I'm sorry, the interpreter doesn't hear the speaker. Yes, there was a lack of knowledge. We didn't know what to define. A few years ago, in some areas, you can't park, then there are huge parking lots elsewhere. So we need to know the stock of parking lots. Data is very important. Then the alternatives to alternative to cars, if you will be managing the transportation or transit, this is going to have impacts on cities and on suburbs if we want to offer some alternative to their population. I'm the first one to believe that we need to reduce the offering to change behaviors if you have the right conditions. And for those that transit from suburbs to downtown, if you don't have any alternative to cars, you're going to create other problems, another social inequity on the socio-economical level. This is going to have multiple impacts. This is going to be like a vicious circle. So we haven't been talking about all of this. It's not just a matter of parking. It's also about a matter of development and of public transit.
I'm Vincent Côté, APM. Now, on the street, you have the charging stations. I mean, how do you think things are happening in Montreal on the street, you know, for the charging stations, charging points? And Martin, can you tell us how these are problematic, maybe, possibly, the charging stations? Is that an opportunity also? It's always a matter of challenge. We suppose that our growth in the upcoming years will be around the electric cars, and there are more than 1,000 new vehicles in Montreal that are added on. So that will be a problem. This is not solved just like that, like a piece of cake. We're going to just set charging stations everywhere along the roadway and so on. So on the streets, this is related to the parking matter altogether, because when parks recharge, you need to park them somewhere. So again, this is a big challenge. We don't have any solutions for the charging stations on the streets, and we're looking as we go. We're learning on the go. You know, it's the main watchword for the pandemic situation, maybe, learning as you go. We have a lot of challenges, and we have to be very careful in terms of supply for the charging stations. This may represent a very harmful situation, because if you start setting up charging stations everywhere and then you need to get rid of them eventually because of the REM, you've got to be careful. For all the places when we think that there should be a better use than parking, we have to think about those in many places. All the street corners, all the commercial sections, and so on. We say we're not going to just set up some parking space for recharging. It depends. Those charging stations have to be well thought out. I mean, you need to reconsider this and make sure that it serves a purpose. It's a matter of opportunity, but for us, of course, the opportunity, we see it mainly for the out of the street. If we need to redeploy or deploy in terms of charging stations, there's an underlying question here. What's the role of the private sector? The public sector is starting up the whole movement, but the gas stations, what's going to happen with them? What will be the role of the private sector, not just the public sector? And once everything is electrified, if everything is electric based, so how are things going to work? Because now we go to a gas station, we can go to the pump and, you know, be ready quickly. But what's the role of the private sector? And there's charging stations on the streets also, but it's a matter of equity. Again, you're subsidizing car mobility. There's no greenhouse gas effect, or what? You're again motivating people to have a car. This is 1 o'clock. It's 1 o'clock already, and so we have maybe a little bit of time for a question for the city of Paris. You want to bring down the number of parking lots on the street. Is there a priority for usage, for use, or maybe some identification mechanism in order to foster the integration of auto sharing solutions, maybe other uses, not just in terms of mobility, but just to make sure that things are more democratized in the city when you think about the role that individuals play in a city. We talk about bringing down the number of parking lots or parking spaces, units in the city, on the streets, by 50%. We need to redistribute the parking unit supply for certain users. Sometimes some don't have a choice. they have to opt for that type of mobility. And so indeed, some professionals, I'm thinking about the whole commercial supply, the urban logistics for delivery. I'm thinking about people who are handicapped, for example, who have mobility challenges. And so the problems using collective transit, transportation is well designed in Paris, but it's not well accessible if you have a wheelchair. If you're using a wheelchair, if you're handicapped, it's really hard for you to use that system. We want to bring down the total supply of parking units. At the same time, we promise better sharing. We have increased the delivery areas. We increase the number of units for people who have mobility issues. We have mobility sharing supply, which is increased. We want to redistribute the public space in view of some use that's more fair, equitable, in view of societal and climate-based considerations. The whole rationale is way broader than this. For other use, for example, we have to redesign parking, but this should go hand in hand with different policies, mobility policy, the biking policy, the pedestrian policy. Also, we don't have a lot of space, and so on. So the parking lots are places where we can have cycling routes, where we can put more vegetation. We can add more sidewalks to make sure that the city is more accessible in terms of mobility for pedestrians and so on. We want to create a relationship between use and not just, and we can develop that through bringing down the number of parking lots. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to connect. And thank you to Pierre-Yves Chopin, advisor, mobilité, Vivre en Vivre, Charles de la Chavotière, Business Strategy Mobility Director for l'Agence de Mobilité Durable, et MD Chiara Morina, in charge of hospitality and public space use for the city of Paris, Florence Scherer. She works at La Chaire for UQAM University, Marco Viviani, VP Strategic Development, Communato. Let's give a hand to all of our panel members. Thank you so much to the attendees. Thank you to the people looking at this virtually. We'll have other events. Go online, go to the Agence de Mobilité Durable website if you want to check more details about future events and so on. And so thank you so much for joining us. See you soon.